Hello, friends, and welcome to the rescheduled Snow Week edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's engagement director, and today's episode is brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And this episode was originally scheduled to air live the Monday of the winter apocalypse in Texas, but for obvious reasons, we had to postpone. So this episode is being recorded with each of the participants on their own schedule. And regardless of when we recorded, our thoughts and prayers are certainly with all who have suffered and are still suffering, because we know that this will last for many weeks or maybe more for many Texans. We're certainly thankful for the volunteers, congregations, and first-line workers who provided support for Texans, but we also recognize that Texas has significant work to do to make sure that this never happens again. And that work started this week with a series of state hearings, as we mentioned in our February 22nd episode in the Legislative Update and Action Alert, and which we'll begin to unpack later in this episode with our Executive Director, Bee Moorhead. But before we get there, we're talking today about another serious issue that demands Texans' attention, and that's systemic racism and specifically policing reform. For that, we'll be joined by State Representative Rhetta Bowers to discuss the George Floyd Act. We'll also premiere a new segment entitled Bringing It Home with Reverend Danielle Ayers, Minister of Justice with Friendship West Baptist Church, to discuss how you and your congregation can bring home the state policy discussion on policing reform and racial justice. Today, she'll be joined in that segment by Reverend Edwin Robinson. And finally, as I mentioned, we'll close out the episode with our legislative update and action alert with Bee Moorhead. But first, I am honored to welcome to the conversation Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III, who for most of you needs absolutely no introduction. But Dr. Haynes is the pastor of Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. I had a chance to join them online for church last week and heard that it was the 38th anniversary of his first sermon at Friendship West Baptist Church. And so, Dr. Haynes, happy anniversary. So for 38 years, he has been leading Friendship West as a prophetic pastor, passionate leader, social activist, and eloquent orator and educator. Dr. Haynes is a leader in fighting racial injustice, a passionate advocate for the role of the Black church, and a leader for economic justice and empowering underserved communities. And he is the perfect person to set the theological foundation for our conversation today. So with no further ado, Dr. Haynes, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is now yours for this week's Weekly Witness. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you so much to Texas Impact. Thank you, Scott, for your leadership that I believe is ushering in a new era in the life of Texans. And of course, the recent winter apocalypse, as you have so appropriately described it, has been magnified by bad policies that need to be corrected. And so the work of Texas Impact is greater now than ever before. The work of Pastor Danielle Ayers, the Reverend Edwin Robinson is as necessary as ever before. And so I salute you, I salute them, and share with you briefly this theological framing. And I appreciate so much the determination to keep this within a moral and theological framework. And I simply this day talk about the cross and lynching. The cross and lynching. It's a remix on the wonderful, late, great father of Black liberation theology. And so I want to talk about the cross and lynching. George Floyd was lynched. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we watched in horror. But for some of us, we had ugly flashbacks to a time of terror in these disunited states where persons who were those who celebrated white supremacy decided in their terrorist ugliness to pose for pictures in front of, surrounding Black lynched bodies that hung as strange fruit, to use the language of Billie Holiday. And so George Floyd was lynched. The question becomes, is there a theological framing for a lynching as we dare to push for the George Floyd Act? Yes. James Cone, who I referenced earlier, testified that he was in a similar space as many of us are right now, because the riots of 1967 in Newark and Detroit, along with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the drum major for justice in 1968, had shaken him out of his theological complacency. Listen to his testimony. He says, I was forced to realize the bankruptcy of my own theology in America that did not engage the religious meaning of the African American struggle for justice. What he was saying is that we needed a theology that would speak to the horrors that were going on in these disunited states. And in his wonderful work entitled The Cross and the Lynching Tree, it is powerful and prophetic. He illustrates something that speaks to where we are in this legislative session. He spoke of Hale Woodruff, who captured the hell and hope of lynching in a print entitled By Parties Unknown. It shows a lynched Black man dumped on the doorsteps of a Black church with a rope around his neck. The evidence is that this Black life has been snatched. It has been aborted, for those of you who are pro-life, by circumstances, no, by white supremacy. And as a consequence, sadly, he's left on the doorstep of a Black church with a rope around his neck. But wait, that's not all that we see. For Hale Woodruff also shows that there are flowers that are growing where the rope touches the ground. Is that not a powerful statement of what? Horror, hell, and hope. And that is what we are bringing to this legislative session. Our theology understands and acknowledges the horror and the hell of lynching. It acknowledges and recognizes that what happened to George Floyd, it was horrible, it was horrific, it was hate-filled, it was hell on earth. That's what happened to George Floyd. And yet, according to Hale Woodruff, that's not the end of the story, because there are flowers that signify new life that were growing out from under that rope. And so the word, according to James Cone, speaks of a hope that although a white racist could take the life of George Floyd, his life does not have to be deprived of ultimate meaning. And that is why we are driven. That is what calls us during this legislative session. And that is that the cross reminds us that terrorism and lynching does not have the last word. God has the last word. And since God has the last word, just as the cross is transformed into a plus sign, I like that right there, a plus sign that lets us know that there is meaning that can come out of terror and the hell of lynching. Meaning can come out of that. George Floyd, his life was taken from us. He was lynched. But what we are saying with the George Floyd Act, theologically, that his life still has meaning. Yes, his death can still have meaning. And out of his death, we can birth brand new life with this George Floyd Act. That is our challenge. That is our hope. May the flowers of a policy that transforms this dark yesterday into a bright tomorrow recognize that George Floyd's life and death can have meaning, and that meaning can give us hope out of this horror, love and liberation out of this lynching. Thank God for the cross that tells us that there is liberated meaning even from a terrorist lynching.
Amen. Dr. Haynes, thank you so much for that word. I know that you certainly have me ready to get to work on this issue on the George Floyd Act, and I know many of our listeners will look forward to the conversation that comes the rest of today. So thank you so much for your time. All right, next I would like to welcome to the conversation State Representative Rhetta Bowers. Representative Bowers was elected to serve House District 113 in the Texas House of Representatives originally in 2018. And in terms of her bio, probably most relevant to this conversation is the fact that she was recently appointed vice chair of the Texas House Committee on Homeland Security and Public Safety, as well as being a member of the Texas House Committees on Natural Resources and the Local and Consent Calendars Committee. So Representative Bowers has invested a lifetime of energy and public service and service to her community. She has served as a substitute teacher and PTA member with the Garland Independent School District. She was appointed to the Rowlett Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, where she served for 8 years. And recently, Representative Bowers has served as the chair of the Dallas Women's March, all while being a member of St. Paul United Methodist Church and the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, of which she's a lifetime member. But one of my favorite memories of Representative Bowers, and Representative, I don't know if you'll remember this, but at the 2019 United Methodist Women's Legislative event, you came down and greeted the United Methodist women in the Capitol on their Capitol Day and told them that United Methodist women from your church had been trying to get you to come to that event for years. And so, yeah. And so I remember them saying like, hey, one of us is representing us in the Capitol, and they really made a really great connection with you. And so I'm so thankful for your willingness to serve and your willingness to be here today. So thank you.
No, thank you, Scott. Thank you for having me and for reminding me of that moment. That was a very special moment. And I remember soon after that, I invited everyone to the chamber, the House chamber, and really gave a great greeting and shout out to the United Methodist Women. So it was the irony in that they had been asking me for years, please come. And so it took hitting the campaign trail and making elected office happen to get me here. So, well,
as a United Methodist myself, that was a fun memory for me too, and I'll remember it. I remember it fondly. So let's start off. I mean, the topic of the day, we're going to talk about the George Floyd Act and systemic racism, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, in the midst of what the state of Texas just went through last week, how are you doing? How's the district after the winter storms?
The district is just like many Texans all across the state is under recovery and truly repair. But thankfully, we were able to really just disseminate information across the district via social media to just share information on really if you had loss of power and where to go to get that restored, or if you did have burst pipes, how to get a plumber, making sure that you were not faced with any scams. And then of course, if you needed to contact your insurance agency. And then ultimately we have now, with hearings this week here in Austin in the Capitol, with State Affairs and Energy Resources committees, we have started asking people to tell your story from the freeze, and really to commit to virtual testimony, and that it will be added to the record, and that their voices do matter in this. So,
all right. I appreciate that. That story collection is important and something we've been talking about since the storm hit. So moving us into the topic of the day, and I mentioned that Dr. Haynes has really set you up for this conversation well. But in the wake of the homicides of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and more last summer, it became clear that the Texas legislature had to act, had to do something this legislative session. And the Texas Legislative Black Caucus has introduced the George Floyd Act. There was a press conference around that toward the end of last summer. Can you kind of catch us up to speed? What does that legislation include as of now?
Sure. Well, the George Floyd Act, and I want to say that before I get into what it all entails, I really do believe that it, based on the footsteps of the young people on the streets and protesting all across the nation and the world's uproar, it is imperative upon the legislature to take those footsteps and those protests and now convert that into policy to make a real difference. And
right.
So the George Floyd Act, authored by the dean, Democratic dean of the Texas House, the Honorable Symphonia Thompson out of Houston, that I had the privilege and pleasure of watching as a child be the greatest legislator, is the author of the George Floyd Act, and the Texas Legislative Black Caucus certainly supports her 110%. I mean, it is comprehensive law that containing several important provisions that advocates and legislators have long sought, and I have to say that, long sought to put into law. The act itself addresses qualified immunity, and creates a new state law where victims and their families of police violence, they can surely sue law enforcement. Then, of course, duties for peace officers, requiring them to prevent crimes and rescue those at risk of death or injury. Limit use of force, which is one that I have certainly advocated for with de-escalation. And then to end arrest of fine only violations, and requires corroboration of undercover testimony. That undercover testimony cannot be used from potentially corrupt officers. And then, lastly, one that gets talked about a lot is that departments hold officers accountable. It creates a strong disciplinary matrix that holds officers accountable for their actions. And I think that part of the bill lends itself to those officers that could be considered bad apples, that they are not able to just go from agency to agency without any kind of accountability system. And, it is something that we saw the world pause in those 8 minutes and 46 seconds that George Floyd suffered. And, I will say the Legislative Black Caucus is ready to push forward. And after being named, as you said, Scott, appointed vice chair of Homeland Security and Public Safety, I knew that those big bills and big issues were coming my way now. And it's a committee that I want to say that I didn't ask for. I'm honored to serve because I do believe that in the district, I have tried to bridge the gap between law enforcement and community. And statewide, I have tried to stand up for individuals in our community, and took a different approach last year when the protests and riots started. I did a law enforcement listening series, so I'll stop there. I tried to say, hey, let's talk, because maybe I knew that these conversations needed to happen, and that next session, certainly we knew we needed to address these issues.
Well, we are certainly glad that you were there for a moment such as this. And you mentioned the young people. You mentioned people marching. You mentioned the importance of bringing together people for conversation. And certainly many congregations and people of faith were engaged in both marching and conversations throughout this summer. Many clergy preached and talked about issues related to systemic racism over the course of the last year. And for sure, the George Floyd Act is going to garner a lot of attention this legislative session. But are there other pieces of legislation that Texans of Faith should be monitoring to address some of the concerns that we've talked about in congregations of race?
Yes, sir. Thank you for asking. So many pieces of civil rights and criminal justice reform legislation coming from the Texas Legislative Black Caucus in particular. But HB, or House Bill 392, is my own piece of civil rights legislation. It's the Texas Crown Act. And the Crown Act stands for, the acronym itself, creating a respectful and open world for our natural hair. And it prohibits race-based hair discrimination, which is in House Bill 392, the denial of employment and educational opportunities because of hair texture or protective styles that would include braids, locks, twists, and Bantu knots. And so my bill prohibits hair discrimination in education, employment, and housing. And I believe that people should, and specifically African Americans and people of color, should be able to attend events like prom and graduation from school wearing their natural hair. And that people should be able to work. I witnessed a lady here in the Capitol with beautiful locks, and I thought how nicely groomed she was, and I thought, wow, that's what it's all about. You should be able to work wearing your natural hair. People should be able to live where they want with their natural hair, with their natural hair, and come to the table as themselves. It's time for people. The time for people feeling like they must put harsh chemicals. I recently stopped for the second time putting harsh chemicals on my own hair. I do that no more. Or that they should have to go through painful techniques to conform to certain perspectives of aesthetics. It needs to end. And I believe people should not miss out on any opportunities nor success because of the way they choose to wear their hair naturally, and that children should grow up knowing that they are perfect just the way God made them. And I have to say that, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention Ajwa Asamoah and the Crown Coalition out of Washington, D.C., that my sorority sister, they called me in the fall of 2019 after I was a freshman right at the end of session. And I did not think, Scott, that Texas was ready for this kind of legislation. But I soon found out that these were, just like I knew, there were conversations that were being had around people's kitchen tables and at the hair salon and the barbershop, but they were kept there, and kind of swept under the rug and not really let out. So, the Crown Act has passed in 7 states, and that does include Washington, California, Colorado, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia. It's currently filed in 19 states. And so I'm hoping that Texas is the next place that it passes.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. And you just made me take some notes right there. So thanks for that. Anything else that you hope that folks will be watching this legislative session?
Like I said, when we first started talking about the George Floyd Act, when you think about it, I have to say, when it talks about those fine-only violations, we would be remiss if we didn't mention Sandra Bland. And that's a piece that's a long-awaited final piece of the Sandra Bland Act. The fact that it should end arrests for fine-only violations. And I remember prior to becoming a first-time candidate for the Texas House, working with the Texas Coalition of Black Democrats on that very piece of legislation on the Sandra Bland Act. And then as a legislator in 2019, just how the pain we all felt when we had to vote on that piece of legislation 3 times in the House, and we could not get it passed. Right. 3 times. I mean, talk about heaviness. I remember just going home that weekend in particular, Scott, and I flew home, and I got home and I just went to my room in complete darkness, and I could not speak. It just because you knew that it was time for that, right?
Mhm.
And not knowing that we were going into 2020 when something could happen like it did to,
Right.
as you said, not just George Floyd, but Breonna Taylor and Tatiana Jefferson and Ahmaud Arbery and Botham Jean. It just
Mhm.
keeps going. And, I would be remiss, you ask about all the numerous bills. There are, the George Floyd Act includes legislation that legislators have tried for years to put into
Yeah.
law. And, I would be remiss if I didn't say it was the shooting of Philando Castile that just sent me over the edge. And that led us to the Dallas ambush. And unfortunately, I was out there with my children stranded. And, I did in turn go to the funeral of those 5 slain officers. It was a time that one of the times that I really saw law enforcement coming to our aid, even having been out there marching, right?
Mhm.
And that day was peaceful. So, I think with my story, that is the one thing. Not only I have members of my family that are in law enforcement in Houston, but it is why I think I am able, the mother of of an African American mom of an African American son, and I'm able to still extend that olive branch.
All right. Well, there is certainly important work to do, and our folks will ask the question, "What can I do to help you?" So I feel like Texas Impact staff, I can tell folks what they can do, but they hear it a lot better coming from their elected representatives. So what can we do to support your work on this front?
I would say right now that we're still in a time of COVID and the pandemic. If you find a piece of legislation, you go on the House website and you find a piece of legislation that you truly care about, please contact your state representative or your state senator to show your support on the other hand, but also to tell them about legislation that you don't agree with. I will say, as a member of the Texas House, that members do listen. We listen to our constituents. One reason that we have to is they are there to hopefully reelect us. Our reelection depends on that. But we want you to reach out to us and tell us what you think is best, how we can make our communities better places to live, and in times in non-COVID times, Scott, I would tell you to come to the Capitol to advocate. But, due to the pandemic, most of our meetings are like you and I are talking right now, are virtual. And it is helping us to keep government going in the best way that we can, in the safest way that we can. And I'll say this, often members will meet with our constituents if time permits, but you should always feel free and that you're able to meet with our staff, because they certainly are an extension of us. And they try not to answer for us, but they certainly relay all that information to us. And I mentioned the virtual testimony. Now that when we changed the House rules coming into the 87th legislative session, it made it possible for us to do not virtual voting, virtual testimony, but we have to be able in this climate to do business, not per se as usual, but business. We have to do the business that we were elected to do, and we want to do it safely. So, I can tell you right now, after last week, my constituents definitely reached out. They reached out in a personal way, but I think they felt like we were there to answer the call.
And you've been a good example, and there are many members across the state who have been more than willing to set up Zoom meetings, and we have some of our members who talk to you regularly and really appreciate that two-way communication. So thank you so much for that word of advice, and appreciate your staff and the work they've done. I know it was rough for everybody last week, and so I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for all you do, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation as the session moves on.
Thank you. Likewise, Scott, and you be careful, stay safe, and thank you for all that you do.
All right. Well, it's good talking to you, and we'll talk to you soon. As I mentioned in the open, we are introducing a new weekly witness segment today entitled Bringing It Home, featuring Reverend Danielle Ayers, Minister of Justice with Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas and a Texas Impact board member, to discuss how your congregation can bring home our weekly witness conversations. And we plan on bringing this segment to you about once a month. And so I am excited to turn it over today with my friend and an amazing pastor, Reverend Danielle Ayers, and her guest for today, Reverend Edwin Robinson with Dallas Black Clergy. So Danielle, take it away.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you all those who are joining this weekly witness, this important conversation discussion around the George Floyd Act. Fannie Lou Hamer once said that she felt close to Christianity when she was able to get involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Because for her, that was her congregation, and that it recognized her humanity, it affirmed who she was, but it also equipped her to be able to deal with a lot of the social injustices that she saw every day, whether that was the Voting Rights Act, whether that was environmental racism, whether that was food injustice. She felt that was her place to feel close to God, and how she viewed not only Christ and God, but also the church and the kingdom of God. And so that is who we are at Friendship West. We really are about how do we equip our congregations, first of all, to understand they are God's child, and that we all have should have access to life-giving, life-sustaining resources, and we should be able to move about and freely move about without being harassed and harried by institutions, whether that's physical violence or structural violence. And so that's who we are at the church. That's what we try to do. We try to do Jesus and justice. We don't separate the two. And this is a very, obviously a very important topic and conversation for us as it relates to criminal justice reform and the ways in which Black communities in particular are over policed, over surveillance, and this ongoing gaze of Black bodies. And what that means for us is usually a deadly consequence. And so I brought on Reverend Edwin Robinson with me because he works very closely with community as well. He represents Dallas Black Clergy, and I just want him to give us a little bit about what over policing, what this over surveillance of Black bodies, trying to have agency over Black bodies and the movement, our movements, what that means for us in everyday life, and why it's so important for us to put the right measures in place, right policies in place, while at the same time challenging Christian communities, right, to make sure they are not having a dualistic theology, and that is where they only look to worship God on Sundays, but they have nothing to say about what happens to bodies throughout the week. And so, Edwin, I want you to talk a little bit about how this impacts us every day, and then I'll come back and talk about maybe some practical ways in which congregations can be engaged to make sure this act is passed, and not only stop there, but how we continue to work on criminal justice reform, if not dismantling the entire system and reconstructing something totally different that's more equitable.
Thanks so much, Reverend Ayers, for just inviting me. And Scott, it's good to be here. It's always good to be a part of anything that I always say the church that I claim, Friendship West, is doing, and particularly under the leadership of Dr. Haynes, who is a leader among leaders. And so I'm just grateful to be a part. So I'll jump right into it. I have the title Reverend in front of my name, which means that some point in time, I find myself in the church and working in the church. I'm working on staff as a pastor at times, and now really working deeply in the community. But on July 13th, 2015, it was a very interesting day for me because not only was that the day that I sort of left actually working on staff, like in the church as a pastor, but it was also the day that our dear sister Sandra Bland was murdered. And I found myself a few days later in Waller County, transitioning from a job of being a pastor and a staff pastor, and quickly became an organizer in the field, working with the AME Church and working with our people on the ground. in Waller County. I remember that day so vividly, the day that I was going, because at the time I wasn't a member of Friendship West, and I had only gone by there a few times, but I knew before I took the journey down to Waller County to deal with our people that I had to go and stop by Friendship West and heard a sermon from Dr. Haynes that gave me courage, and then was able to stop and have a conversation with him. And he blessed me as I went on my way. Nevertheless, I bring that up because what happened to our dear sister Sandra was absolutely avoidable. We all know this. Our legislature even realized it, so much to the point that we passed the Sandra Bland Act not too long after. But the impetus for Sandra Bland even being stopped, even being arrested, is what we're addressing in this George Floyd Act. The reality that police can actually arrest you or arrest anybody for a non-jailable offense is quite asinine, to say the very least, right? Imagine you are driving and you're in the car, and you're either by yourself or with your children, and you're not paying attention, and your kids are arguing in the back seat, and you turn around and you know you shouldn't have done it. You violated the law, of course, but you run that stop sign, and then all of a sudden you see those lights flashing behind you. You didn't realize that you ran a stop sign, but they pull you over and you say, "Mr. Officer, what is my offense?" And the officer simply says, "Step out of the car." And then all of a sudden you find yourself in handcuffs, and all of a sudden you find yourself in jail. Now that's quite ridiculous. However, that is legal in the state of Texas. That is legal. Police have the right to do just that. They have the right to arrest anyone they like for particular offenses that are not jailable. In that instance, no one is saying that you were in the right by distracting your attention, from driving a very important thing with your children in the car. Even so, no one is saying that that was the right thing to do. No one was also saying it was right for you to run that stop sign. But that incident should not cause you to have to be handcuffed, be fingerprinted, be pictured, and be locked behind bars. The reality is, a number of you who are watching this, depending on your economic status or even your race, that seems like something that could never happen in your world. Unfortunately, for those of us who don't have the same economic status or are of dark bodies, particularly Black people in our city and in our state, that is a reality that we face every day. That means every time we get into our cars, every time we go out on the street, we're worried about a minor infraction. Did I jaywalk today? Will that get me arrested? Could that be the end of my life? This should not be the case for anybody in our cities. It shouldn't be the case for anybody in our neighborhoods. The George Floyd Act is attempting to remedy that reality, to look at the policy and say, look, we're not saying that people should not follow the law. And we're not saying that officers don't have a role to play in our communities and in public safety. But what we are saying is that their authority should not be such that they could arrest someone for something that would be a minor ticket, maybe $50, maybe $150, and then that end up being the end of their life because of the realities of what happens when Black people get arrested. When Black people get arrested, we lose our livelihood. When Black people get arrested, we're more than likely to be convicted. When Black people get arrested, we're more than likely to get a disease from being inside jails that have very low health standards. When Black people get arrested, we're more than likely to lose our jobs. When Black people get arrested, we're more than likely to even lose our families over minor violations that could be handled by police officers simply doing their job in protecting and serving the community, not protecting and serving a stop sign or protecting and serving a stoplight. That is the role of police in our communities. And so often we find ourselves having to marshal our resources of the church and of the community to fight back against things that are simply common sense, We have an opportunity right now with the George Floyd Act right now in legislation to remedy that so that we can all get down to the business of taking care of all those things that are very important in our communities. We have an economy that we need to be working on. We have healthcare that we need to be getting for our families. And the fact that we have to spend this much energy and this much time dealing with something as common sense as not arresting people for non-jailable offenses is kind of crazy. It's a bit ludicrous. Nevertheless, here we are. But we can fix this today. With you listening to this, hearing the sermon of Dr. Haynes, getting involved in your communities, calling your representatives, whomever they are, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, it does not matter. This is about all of us. This is about our safety in our communities, and not allowing those individuals who have the authority and the badge and the gun to be able to terrorize our lives for simply making mistakes, right? We all make mistakes. We all do something that we didn't mean to do. And this is an opportunity to remedy the reality of making our community safe so that we can take care of the things that are so important in our community, again, like healthcare, like education reform, like all these other things that infrastructure reform, right? Most of us sitting in our homes, right? And there's people with water damage and ice everywhere. These are the things that we could be working on. So let's take care of this. Let's go on and get this out of the way so we can get down to the business of continuing to make our communities and our families safer. Let's pass this George Floyd Act. We don't want anybody having to deal with these unnecessary consequences. And with that, I give it back to you, Reverend Ayers.
Well, thank you, Reverend Edwin. That was both a powerful testimony, and it was also just an amazing way to really lay bare to the importance of passing this George Floyd Act. And so what I would just say to the congregations, the clergy, the pastors who are listening, the first thing, and that really speaks to Edwin's testimony, is, and I could be a little biased here, but I think nobody does this better than Dr. Haynes in terms of preaching a message on a Sunday morning when you have a captive audience, a message that both deals with the soul of people where they feel affirmed and loved by God, but also challenging people to then translate that into a faith that takes them out into the streets, that takes them into corridors of power to look to change these structures that we're trying to challenge and confront, and to have open conversations and dialogue around understanding that it is white supremacy that continues to undergird and uphold these very systems we're trying to challenge and change. And so it's going to require particular theology to challenge that. And so I think, perhaps what people can do is, one, preach that. And if that's not what you preach, how do you listen to a sermon by Dr. Haynes, right, to get an understanding of how he has a theological framing and how he views the text from the bottom up, so you can put yourself in the position of those who are dispossessed, those who, as Howard Thurman would say, have their backs against the wall. So I think that's the first thing we can do is, what are we preaching and teaching in our churches? Let's really pay attention to that. And what is our theological framing? And are we viewing it from the bottom up? And do we really see people who are suffering? So I think that's one thing. Because Edwin's powerful testimony that he stopped by Friendship West. He just stopped by and got what he needed to move on and do the amazing work that he's doing. So the power of the word cannot be underestimated. So that's number one. I think number two, it is having some real thoughtful dialogue and conversations with your congregation about what this really means. So it's not just, it's the act, yes, but it's also why this act is necessary. And that has a lot to do with how we view people, how we value people, and how we often construct systems in society that really are, tailored and purposely put in place to disempower and dehumanize, Black and brown communities. So how do we have that real honest dialogue and conversation as Christians, right? As those of us who claim to be disciples of Christ, how do we do that? So I think that conversation has to take place. And then I would say those who are allies, right? How important it is not to be translators in this conversation, but to just tell the truth, to be truth tellers and justice seekers. So that would mean listen to what Reverend Robinson just laid out. Don't translate it, don't change it. Just say it how he said it plainly, right? So how do we not take up space? How do we not change the narrative or insert ourselves in that narrative? Tell the story of the people, give people the opportunity and the platform to speak for themselves. So amplify people's voices, not try to be a voice for the people. I think that's another thing congregations can do. You don't have to be a mega church to do that, right? You just have to be a willing vessel to do that. That doesn't take mega church money to be a truth teller and justice seeker. So I think those are some of the things we can do, and to educate yourself on the policy, right? So that you can contact your elected official and add your own personal story to that and not just recite what the policy is, right? You want to be able to also have your own personal testimony, your own personal story to tell along with the policy, because they know the policy, right? By and large, they have a sense of what that is. So how do you also humanize this policy? It's not just bodies, but hey, this is someone, this was George Floyd, this was Breonna Taylor, like name it, call the names of those folks and those who we don't know. And just know this is a systemic issue, whether they're impacted or not, many are. And because they are, we should see ourselves as being communal. And as Christians, we sort of should be concerned about all of God's creation, right? If we truly believe we all are fearfully and wonderfully made and in the image of God, then we ought to be able to speak up and use our privilege and our positions to be strong advocates for this act and many others. As Edwin laid out, we have so much other important work that we must do to bring more equity into many of our broken social structures that really need to be deconstructed and reconstructed. And that's going to take many of us who claim to be Christians to do that in ways that are life-giving, affirming, and life-sustaining. So we can be those places, right? Places where justice, peace, love, liberation can truly be lived out. If not the church, then who? So that's what I would offer up as ways that churches can begin to be involved. So for this segment, thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, Dr. Haynes, always for the privilege of being able to serve on staff and to be my pastor of over 20 years. I thought about that the other day. I'm like, man, I'm getting old. Over 20 years, I've been at Friendship West, and that has certainly shaped my theology, my view of God, and who I am as a woman of God, right? To walk boldly into prophetic ministry. So for that, I'm always grateful. And for my brother in the struggle, Edwin, I thank you for joining me during this segment. Thank you so much, Scott, and Texas Impact.
Well, I want to thank both of you and also reiterate something that I say quite often, that democracy is not a spectator sport. And Weekly Witness is not here to be like entertainment that you consume. Right. The purpose of this program is for you to have the resources to go back to your congregations, to go back to your communities, to go back to your networks with the resources to help shape public policy in the state of Texas. And we've now had this new segment that talks about ways that you can bring it home to your community. And we have an entire episode now with Dr. Haynes laying a theological foundation that would also benefit your congregation. We have Representative Bowers talking about the specifics of an act that you can use to help educate your community. And you now have Reverend Ayers and Reverend Robinson giving you that challenge to go back and tell this story. So my hope is that you're not just going to turn off the episode, turn off the podcast and go back to your lives, but that we're actually going to do something with this information that's going to influence this public policy. And so Reverend Ayers, thank you so much for this segment. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation in the weeks to come. All right, for our next segment, we are going to talk about the response to the winter storm. So you'll remember in our Monday episode, our February 22nd episode, that Josh previewed the state, House, and Senate hearings for what I think could safely be called the botched preparation for and response to the winter storms. He outlined an action alert that you can still find on our website at texasimpact.org, which challenge folks to share their stories both on our website and with the Senate committees, but also to call your representatives with 4 messages: to be honest, to be proactive, to be practical, and to be just. And we promised that in this episode, we would have Josh come back to tell us how those hearings went. Well, spoiler alert, it's Friday and the hearings are still going on. And so Josh is watching those hearings and we'll have a chance to talk with us again Monday, but we have a special guest taking his place today. And that's our executive director, Bee Moorhead. Bee, how are you feeling?
Tired after the hearings last night, but ready to talk about it.
That's good that you responded to your feelings, because Josh doesn't like that. So that's one difference we can have when you're with us. So tell us how it went. It was a long day. I know we were, it was a solid 15 hours, I think, of hearings yesterday. What are your first reactions?
So I have 3 initial thoughts. And I mean, obviously the hearings are still going on and it's important to let them play out completely. But understanding that basically it's the same set of witnesses testifying twice, we got to hear, I think, a lot of what the non-legislative actors were going to say yesterday. Most of them got to say it in one chamber or the other, I think. And then we're starting to get a sense of what the legislators in the 2 different chambers, how they're approaching the issue. The thing, my initial thought is, and I think I'm not alone in this, and we've been saying it all week, this is a super chaotic strategy for holding these hearings. Instead of either holding them on 2 separate days in each chamber, so that everybody could just focus in one chamber or the other. Or what they could also have done would have been to hold one big hearing with members of both the House and the Senate together, hearing all the testimony one time. The fact that they held them at the exact same time on the exact same days with the exact same witnesses, just kind of swapping them back and forth, meant that anybody who was actually trying to interact with the process was really challenged. It made the process more opaque even than it otherwise would have been. It was already going to be kind of problematic. It's compounded by COVID restrictions. And also, it's a very complex subject matter. And legislators, some of them have been working on this issue for a long time. They're very conversant on it. Others of them, this is the first session that they've really had to take up this issue, the idea of the, how does the grid work? Where do they get their energy? All that stuff. And so they are having to dive into the deep end, into a very crowded pool. Well, I won't strain over this metaphor. It was really chaotic. To their credit, they sure didn't shortchange the time that they had with the witnesses. We were kind of amazed at how long they kept some of the witnesses answering questions, but that's good. What you want to see is legislators really digging into the information. Concerning for Texas Impact, I would say deeply concerning, is the language that we heard from committee chairs, in some cases kind of demanding that industry representatives who were testifying about the various ways in which the grid didn't perform last week, the legislators demanding that those industry representatives have plans on their desk for how to fix it, plans on the legislator's desk. So essentially saying industry needs to write us a bill so that this will never happen again. Well, I think from the standpoint of ratepayers, anyone who pays an electric bill or a water bill can picture how the solution that the industry might think of might not be the exact same solution that a constituent would think of. And the entire hearing from top to bottom was constituent voiceless. It was only invited testimony, which is not surprising because, again, it's a complicated topic, and they're still going on day two, and they only invited, probably a dozen witnesses for each chamber. So having a parade of Texans who are mad about their electric bill probably wouldn't have been the right kickoff for this topic. But telling the members of the industry leadership that you hope that they will write a bill for you to fix it, I think the term for that is something to do with foxes and hen houses, and the public ought to watch really carefully. Finally, sorry to cut you off. I'll say that the third immediate thought I have after having watched yesterday is, I think we all know, and the media have made clear, and the industries have made clear, this is a climate resilience issue. It's not just a question about pricing in the electric market. This is a question about how Texas or any other state or community makes itself resilient to what in disaster recovery they would describe as all threats. Okay, so what we heard tell about yesterday was, we're so used to Texas being super hot in the summer, but we're just not used to preparing for it to be cold in the winter. I would suggest to you there's a lot of other possible things that we don't prepare for either, because we just don't expect them to happen. And one of the early testimonies yesterday morning from a meteorologist with the Lower Colorado River Authority, he alluded to, people are skeptical when the weather guy says there's something nonlinear coming. People say, oh, well, those guys, they're always alarmists. It's hard to be in a posture of resilience if you're going to try so hard to maintain your posture of skepticism. So this is not a question about, wow, it's a good thing that we're never going to have any scary environmental disruption like that again, because we have a good thing going and we'd like to keep it that way. We're going to need to consider every single aspect of our infrastructure and think about ways in which it is currently resilient and not resilient, and work as 29 million people, not just 181, to make ourselves resilient.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because it did seem to me that that public pressure and the public being so upset kind of drove a lot of things that have happened over the course of the last 72 hours or so.
Sure.
Certainly they called this hearing in a hurry. They spent a lot of time. And for those of us who've watched a lot of these hearings, there seem to be like less members going in and out of the room. People seem to be staying and engaged. But the process isn't over yet, right? And we're not going to have an action alert today. We had an action alert Monday. You can check out that messaging and that information. But what should people do over the course of the coming weeks to make sure that these issues stay front and center?
Well, so one thing that came up a couple of times yesterday, but not in any significant way like it should have, was what a few legislators have already been doing around climate resilience. There is a body now in the House, the Texas Caucus on Climate, Environment, and the Energy Industry. And I'm happy to say they have a Facebook page. You can find them on Facebook at TX Climate Caucus. That's their Facebook handle. The members of that caucus have filed climate legislation, and the chair of the caucus, Aaron Zwiener, the representative from outside Austin, replied to me on Twitter at one point and said, as soon as we get these hearings over with, we're going to be pushing our climate bills. That's what people can say right now is, don't think that you're going to get through this current crisis without talking about the long-term future of climate resilience for the state. And there are not a ton of those bills, so I can give them to you now, if that would be okay.
Go for it. We'll publish these throughout the session when they start moving. But go ahead.
But I will tell you that there's HB 1821 by Zwiener. And let me just say that all of these bills basically have the same framework, which is the state needs to plan comprehensively, holistically for climate change, rather than wishing and hoping and asserting that it's not happening. Rather, the state needs to do what I think 30 plus states have already done, which is to establish proactive measures to address climate changes that are happening to our state. So House Bill 1821 by Zwiener, House Bill 1044 by Anchia, House Bill 2017 by Theory, House Bill 1956 by Beckley, House Bill 1949 by Crockett, House Bill 2206 by Tallarico, and then two Senate bills, Senate Bill 306 by Eckhart and House Bill 535 by Eckhart. So that small list of bills are the ones that right now people who are listening to this podcast could start calling legislators and saying, I want those bills to get a hearing, and when they do, I want to talk about them. Another thing the public can still do today and through Monday is go on the public comment portals in the House and Senate. And I don't have those pulled up right this second, but I feel like we've put those are already in the action alert, and they're on our website. But since so many people can't go to the Capitol because of COVID, there are public bulletin board places where people can go to submit comment. Do that now. They're still open till Monday, and this is a great time to make sure that we get robust public comment at the front end of this process.
So continuing on the climate resilience theme, we've been talking in this episode about systemic racism, and Dr. Haynes gave us a good start Representative Bowers talked about the George Floyd Act and other pieces of legislation relating to systemic racism. Reverend Ayers and Reverend Robinson just talked about how local congregations could make that happen. Systemic racism is also a part of climate resilience and disaster response too, right? How do we need to be thinking about that?
Absolutely. One of the things, or maybe the most important thing that I think the faith community can keep in front of everyone is that all of the issues are interconnected, right? So it's not that we think about racial justice in one silo, and then when we get to climate or energy or any other issue, we say, well, this is a different silo, so those same principles won't apply. It's that climate is intimately related to, one, disaster response for sure, two, environmental injustice, which is frequently completely coexisting with racial injustice, both in the United States and globally. And then that is related to migration, which of course is a huge racial justice issue in the United States. Not only racial justice, but certainly that's part of it. And so what the faith community can do is keep bringing policymakers back to the center. And the center is this idea that we have of beloved community, where everyone gets their needs met, everyone gets to participate in the way that we mediate our differences and come to solutions that work for the common good. We heard yesterday, I'll just share this one quick story. We heard yesterday a legislator talk to a representative from an energy company who was testifying, who said, sort of surprisingly, I think to a lot of people, talked to the representative of the energy company about what great customer service they got during the blackout. And the customer service that they got was from a government affairs official in the energy company. Well, I think to anyone who is sort of centering their thinking around vulnerable communities, communities of color, marginalized communities, they would say, I'm not really sure that people who are in positions of power getting access to government affairs officials in energy companies constitutes the kind of equitable treatment that we are hoping for. So in advocating for sustainable energy and advocating for affordable energy and advocating for good customer service, I guess, we're always bringing it back to there are communities that have been historically, systemically disadvantaged in all of these systems. So we could just as easily be having this conversation about healthcare, but with respect to energy, communities of color, low-income communities are the ones that have borne the brunt of environmental degradation from extractive industries. They're the people who have been disenfranchised out of boutique sustainable energy, so that someone who lives in the wrong place or doesn't have enough money, it's not just that they don't get to have solar on their rooftop or a electric car, it's that they are put in the position of kind of being part of the problem, right? And that's not right. So I would urge people, as you think about the racial justice distinctives that we've talked about in this issue today, in this episode of Weekly Witness, that you don't draw a line between things that you would consider to be human issues, say, well, racial justice applies there, and then say, well, infrastructure and environmental stuff is different. There's not quite the same dimension. There's exactly the same dimension because at the end of the day, it all comes back to the way we live together in human community.
All right. Anything you'd like to leave us with today?
Don't forget to get on those portals and make your comments and call your legislator and tell them we're not getting through this without climate legislation.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Bee. Thanks for the time. And I'd like to thank all of the speakers today who put together an episode that I think we can all be excited about. So share it with your friends, share it with your congregations. We certainly have work to do, and you helping spread this content will help us do that. So thank you all for tuning in today. I'd like to remind you before we close that we do still have opportunities for you to participate in Texas Impact programming from the Rapid Response Team and legislative engagement groups, which we've talked about. You can go to texasimpact.org, click on the Action Center link, and be connected with people throughout Texas to have accountable groups and accountable mechanisms to be in communication with your legislators. So make sure to sign up for those. Also, remember that the Texas Interfaith Advocacy Days are coming up March 6th through 9th, and you'll want to make sure to sign up for those at texasimpact.org. If you have questions.
Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
We absolutely have a climate and racial justice panel happening on Monday afternoon at Interfaith Advocacy Days. So hope people will tune into that.
Register today. Those are going to be online this year. We'll have opportunities to engage with folks online, and also a plan to have you meet with your legislators virtually. So if you have any questions about any of that, you can always reach out to me at scott@texasimpact.org. And remember, if you support the work of Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members. You can go online to texasimpact.org/join. Friends, the legislature is gearing up. Hearings are taking place, and your voice is more important now than ever. Let's continue to invite our friends to join us in this work. Stay tuned to texasimpact.org for ways that you can serve. Now, let's get to work.